When we think about God's purpose and God's plan for our lives, it calls for some major changes in us, and that requires a certain amount of submission to His will. Good morning, I'm Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisti, Illinois, with your thoughts for Tuesday. We know that God wants every person on earth to follow Him, to obey His will for their lives. And that takes a great change in us in order to be suitable for God's work. Now, we know that no one can change us or transform us without our permission. Well, unless it's, of course, the governor of Illinois that seeks to impose his mandates on our lives and our conduct, or perhaps the president of the United States that thinks he can make mandates and change our will. No, God wants us to willingly submit to His work in our lives. So Paul calls us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, and he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to Him. He is not calling for us to be martyrs or to offer ourselves up on some altar as a sacrifice. Oftentimes that's the way men do when they follow a false god or in some cult practice. No, Paul is saying, present your body and your mind to God as a sacrifice to His will. Then in Romans 12 and verse 2, Paul says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind to prove His perfect will for us. Paul is calling for us to surrender to the Lord so He can perform the changes that are needed in this worldly mind and heart and conduct of the new believer. We certainly aren't to be conformed or molded by this world to their worldview or their beliefs, or certainly not to their lust-driven actions. He calls for a total transformation. That reminds me of the show Extreme Home Makeover, except this is Extreme Human Makeover. And he reminds us that the only way we can be totally transformed is by the renewing of the mind. We know that whatever we allow into our minds, whether it be by reading or something we see on television or movies that we watch, even the daily conversation that we allow into our thoughts, it'll affect our viewpoint, our worldview for that matter. So Paul begs the church in Romans chapter 1, and he begs us today also, to be transformed by letting God control what comes into our minds and our thoughts on a daily basis. We enter this transformation knowing that it will enable us to follow God's will. It'll enable us to find God's perfect will for the first place and prepare us to be able to follow it daily. You know, carnal Christians or nominal believers, they won't be seeking after God's will. They're always doing their own will. They won't undergo the changes or the transformation that is necessary to obey God's will fully. So Paul calls for us to be a living sacrifice for God that's changed to do His bidding, whatever it is in our lives.